Last point that you made about the lineage
Yeah.
takes me back to the realm of erotica.
Yeah.
So that's where it is very interesting for me, especially looking at homosexual encounters in the erotica.
Yeah.
It's always usually the top is someone who is from a lower caste or a lower class, and a bottom is someone who is from an upper caste and an upper
Right,
class.
right.
So, which is in a way a fantasy and a fetish of the, if we might say, upper caste and the upper class. So, how would you differentiate fetish, desire, and pleasure? And I'll just give a small example. I
Please,
mean, if
yeah.
we actually remember this very controversial advertisement which one of the newspapers carried of a very famous gay activist saying we need a higher groom for our
Right.
yeah.
Right.
So at that time, when the conversations were around that advertisement,
Yeah.
it was all about it's his preference. I mean, it's his desire. I mean,
Yeah.
like, why are you getting into it?
Yeah.
So how do you tackle these kind
Yeah.
of complexity?
Yeah, that's great. I have one of the stories I narrate, I think, in the chapter on armies in the
Armies,
book,
yeah.
is about this Brahmin in the army who has man who has an affair with another man in the army who's a sepoy. And then when he's found out, who's a lower caste sepoy, and when he's found out, he hangs himself because he's so ashamed of his desire, which of course runs counter to everything he's told he should desire. And that to me is just fascinating, you know, that the sense of, and I think this is true of gender as much as it's true of caste, as much as it's true of religion. To go back to what I said earlier, these are conveniences, and we make the mistake of assuming they are essences of some kind, right? And so and the well-known thing about desire is that it has a very intimate relationship with that which is taboo or that which is forbidden. In which case, of course, the minute you say you are upper caste and should not desire anyone below your caste, or else you'll be polluted, the thing is, desire is polluting, right? I mean, how many, you know, you're in the presence of bodily fluids. It's sort of, you know, all kind. It's not clean.
Yeah.
And so, in order then to have sort of an erotic investment that is already in and of itself messy, does one really think caste is going to play you know, a role in barring that? But then to go back to your advertisement, what I found weird about that is, first of all, I'm not a fan of this idea of choice, right? Because it's what people pejoratively call choice feminism, where people say, oh, a woman chooses to change her last name after getting married, or a woman chooses to have children and sit at home and, you know, and not work. And it's like, isn't it incredible to you that millions upon millions of women in the world choose the same thing? You know, it's not. So when choice is meant to be about individuality, it's actually about conformity. And as long as you conform, that can be narrated as choice. But if you break away, that is narrated as something murderous almost, right? Or villainous. So this idea of sort of saying, you know, I want an ayar groom is not choice. It's pure conformity. And so it's to say, you know, you can certainly say, you know what? This is the weird form my desire takes. When I was talking about the feminist earlier, it's absolutely the same for gay activists, right? That I see the spuriousness of opposite gender relationships, but I seem completely blind to the idea of caste opposites or binaries or tensions. But that is how desire works, you know? But instead of trying to sort of protect that and say, oh, it's my choice, which I think is a ridiculous argument that can never hold water, you have to say, you know, desire can be a creepy, weird thing. And here's my creepiness and my weirdness. But I think we're all taught not to acknowledge that publicly. And so it's difficult to do that.
It's difficult to do that.
Absolutely.
Is it possible in India to sort of see something happen and then not have to acknowledge it, or to notice that there is a gay person living next door, or I have seen gay encounters in my life, but then I don't have to talk about it? But how do we step from there to say that this is wrong, this is bad, imprison them,
Yeah.
jail them.
Yeah.
And also your book came a little before the final ruling on the section 377.
Yeah.
So would you have written it differently if you were writing it after the judgment?
No, I mean, in the second edition that's out, I've had to change a couple of lines. But I think if it had come after the judgment, unfortunately, my critique might have been stronger. Well, let me just sort of explain. I think the judgment was fabulous. I think it was long overdue. We absolutely needed it. And I am so grateful that it came in the way that it did. I wish it had come earlier. But anyway, I'm extremely grateful that the 377 judgment happened the way it did. But my critique of it, and this goes back to the earlier part of your question, my critique of it is that there were 4 judgments published because individual judges published individual ones, many of them extremely well written, extremely well argued. But every single one of their examples that they gave in order to justify their own verdict of decriminalization, every single example was from Western history or Western literature or Western culture. There was one footnote reference to something Indian, but nothing whatsoever, which does the ridiculous thing of making Indians, phobic Indians, believe that this is a Western import, right? That homosexuality is a Western import. Whereas, as what you were saying earlier, every one of us in every one of our families has that aunt or that uncle who has not got married, who is nonetheless very much a part of the family fabric, who might have a best friend they go on holidays with, right? Or share a house with or a room. I mean, does anyone have a family member with, or family that's not like that? Absolutely not. So my criticism of the 377 judgment is that not only did it alienate homosexuality even from India, even at the moment when they're decriminalizing it here, by not taking on board our long history and comfort with non-heteronormative desires. Not only did it do that, I feel the legal case that was mounted in the court, and I understand why they did it, but I don't agree with it, minoritized same-sex discourse in a way that I find problematic. So their case was, and this was the winning argument, is that this 377 discriminates against homosexual people and therefore it needs to be banned. As you both know, the language of the law was, and this was owing to Victorian prudery, the language of the law was carnal intercourse against the order of nature. And as I keep saying, there's not a single one of us in this room or anywhere who is sexually active who does not, in fact, have carnal intercourse against the order of nature. And so I think there was a real missed opportunity for us all to think, oh, this doesn't affect me, this affects those people, weird people over there who are westernized. And actually say every single one of us is potentially suspect under this law. And we need to own up to that. In fact, the Supreme Court judgment that overturned the Delhi High Court judgment, the judge in court says, I do not know any homosexual person. I mean, in court. That was the phrase he used in the judgment. In court, in person, he said, I do not know a single homosexual person. And the impunity with which a judge of the Supreme Court can say that, I think we need to attack that kind of impunity. And one of the ways of doing that is to say this affects every single one of us. No matter what our desires, desire itself is suspect. And just because you're happy that it's happening to somebody else somewhere else doesn't mean you're safe. And this, of course, extends to the general political situation in the country today as well. So I really think we all need to believe we're all in this together and we need to fight these battles together.
And therefore, you're not merely chronicling the various forms of desire. You are trying to take it a step forward and say that, this is not all and that there are different ways of looking at desire, which we've had.
Right.
Why this focus on, this fatality of desire being actualized? And then there's, we wondered when we were discussing the book whether there is a parallel to be drawn with the chapter on suicide. Why the fatality of desire? It comes up in the Heer Ranjha context, and there are some popular songs in Punjabi which say that today the lover's dead body will meet the dead body of his or her lover.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And you, in fact, talk about meeting souls. I mean, like that's,
Right.
in a way, an idea.
Yeah. One of the things, one of the ways in which I organized this book, rather than say organizing it under chapters on mythology or history or anything, I organized it according to everyday ideas, right? So a chapter on grammar, or chapter on education, chapter on hair, chapter on makeup, because I wanted to emphasize the fact that these are everyday occurrences. If I had a chapter on mythology, people would have said, oh, those are, that happened a long time ago, or those are for people who read or are interested in reading, whereas we can all relate to what we do with our hair every morning when we wake up, right?
Yeah.
So I'm really invested in thinking about desire as a day-to-day activity that we all participate in, whether consciously or not. That this is something we do with our choice of language, with our choice of dress, with everything. We are in the realm of desire. So desire doesn't become this esoteric thing like homosexuality in a little corner over there. It seeps into every one of our lives on a daily basis. So then the question of fatality, what you both, I think, quite rightly put your finger on. It's less about fatality and more about, or it's about metaphorical fatality, which is to say, for me, desire is our only hope because it is really what kills the boundaries that divide us. So it is the thing, and I've said this before as well, it is the thing that cannot be made to obey. And so when you're in the presence of something that cannot be made to obey, you're in the presence of dissidence, you're in the presence of disobedience, which is why, of course, I am a professor, because I think the space of education and the space of the university, also so much under attack now, is and should be the space of disobedience and the space of dissidence. So there is a sense in which desire is fatal to fixity, to conventionality, to conservatism. Not necessarily to people's lives, even though we know of people around the world who have been killed, murdered, have killed themselves for desire, and in the name of desire, which of course leads to the idea of suicide. And suicide to me, I mean, I sort of have a, you might remember that the Indian law, for instance, was amended maybe 20 years ago to say that suicide or attempted suicide was no longer a crime. Because, of course, it was shocking that someone is bleak enough to want to kill themselves and then if they don't die, labeled criminals. I mean, that was horrible. So my attitude to suicide, especially when there's suicides of, suicide pacts in relation to desire, is that there is something very agential about it. So we think about suicide as despair, as the bottom of the pool, as passive, as not lacking any agency. But as you said, we have all through the history of literature, for instance, you think of Romeo and Juliet, or any, as the template of these stories go, suicide actually becomes slightly different when you think about it in relation to desire. That it becomes more a way of saying, here's a space I can own, and let me do it in a way that I want to, rather than in a way that people are going to tell me. So overwhelmingly, of course, suicides in relation to desire, certainly in India, are of same-sex suicides, intercaste suicides, interreligious suicides. So it's always about carving out a space that stands against the dominant world order as you know it. And so for me, that makes suicide more interesting and less, not objectionable, but less hand-wringing. It's not that, oh, poor things. It seems to me, yes, poor things, that this is the realm they had to carve out for themselves, but good for them that they felt nonetheless the strength of their convictions, that they wanted to carve out a realm for themselves. So suicide is a very interesting idea, I think, in relation to desire.
And also, the Dargah desire, I like that coinage also a lot. Dargah desire is also, is it navigating the same area? Because you see Soni Mahiwal, for example, Soni is the one with agency, right? And her death is not a suicide. Only in the folklore, when you narrate it back again, then you know they are going to die, right? So are they actually similar? Is the death itself similar?
Well, most of the suicide notes, certainly for same-sex couples who kill themselves in India, the suicide note inevitably will say, we are going to be together forever. In the lives that follow. Which is, of course, the same ambition that underlines burial of Peer and a Murid side by side in a dargah, which is that we are Janam Janam Ka Saath, right? We're going to be together forever. which is the trope of romance, right? It is the trope of desiring love. And in fact, it becomes such a powerful trope because it exists in opposition to the world around us. So the power, that's what I was trying to say with suicides, the power of these suicides is that it really points to a different world. Now, whether or not you believe in multiple lives and multiple worlds, it points to the possibility of a different world even in the here and the now. So the trope of life after death or together forever is a trope that is actualized by these two men being buried together in dargahs, by two women killing themselves by drowning themselves, but tying their saris or dupattas together. Right. So they are physically conjoined in a way that they think they will always be.
Yeah. So finally, Madhavi, when this is actually very interesting because as a student, I remember having gender studies as a course. Right. Most of the boys wouldn't take up the course, saying it's about women, like right. It's about women's issues. This itself is problematic on one hand, and on the other hand, what I do not know if you actually agree with me on this, but I uh, lately I see that studying of desire somehow is equated to studying homosexuality.
Right.
Right? As if the realm of desire lies in being queer.
Yeah.
So, do you think this is the kind of an what would you say, kind of an development that's taking place? And also, clearly, your book makes sure that both of them come together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think uh, the idea sort of gender studies, which, I had used to be called women's studies. And so I think that has stuck, that now people assume, oh, it's only women who have a gender. Similarly, people assume it's only homosexuals who have a sexuality. It's like, white people thinking only black people have a race. Or upper caste. Exactly, upper caste people thinking only lower caste have a caste. So this is a sort of dichotomy and a binary that takes place across the power spectrum. And it's clearly not true, and it's clearly not correct, because, of course, we all have gender. That's one of our tragedies in the world, is that we all have gender, and that we're all encouraged to stick to it. And then it becomes a big brouhaha if we don't. So absolutely, I agree with you. I think it is an absolute diminution of conceptual space in the world if we think desire equals homosexuality. Or in fact, if we think homosexuality equals queerness, because queerness for me, certainly with my training and with my politics, queerness is pretty much that which challenges identity rather than reinforcing it. So, and homosexuality, unfortunately, to my mind, is being reinforced more and more as an identity, which is where you have the Ayergroom wanted or the fight for gay marriage in the US, all these things. It becomes a sort of politics of a group, rather than a politics, about all, which is why, of course, this entire rights-based discourse is problematic, because always rights for someone rather than for everyone. So yes, I think that is happening more and more, and I think it shouldn't happen. That this idea of only they have whatever this taboo thing is that I don't want to think about in relation to myself is deeply problematic, but it is actively being encouraged by political regimes around the world, because that's where they get their power from, right? If you can put one group of people and take them and pit them against another group of people, that's where your power comes from. It's what the British taught us a long time ago, divide and rule. So the onus is frankly on us to be less idiotic and to be less stupid and not subscribe to that kind of narrative, because that kind of narrative always and only serves the purpose of power. It only serves the ends of people and regimes that are in power. It does not serve our ends at all, and we need to give up our attachment to these things.
What is the difference between identity and identification? How do we...
Well, I mean, it's an old psychoanalytical concept where, just sort of to put it simply, identity is that which you are given. You're identified as male or female, as upper caste, lower caste, whatever it is, all along all the lines that we know all too well. And identification always involves the movement, which can be a movement across a boundary that you may not be supposed to move across. So, for instance, my identity can be that of a woman, but I might identify as a man or with a man, which is not a socially sanctioned identification at all. But identification is always, going back to your earlier question, is always at play when fantasy is at play, right? So that you're always, if you just look at fantasy films, for instance, right? The reason they are popular is not because we all have, 10 heads or, half green and half orange eyes, but that there is a way in which fantasy allows us to trigger modes of identification that are not allowed to us on a daily basis. And so identification is actually much, much more, to my mind, empowering. So, which again goes against a certain kind of representational politics, right? So if we say we need more women or we need more Dalits, I think absolutely and always we do. But we can't always control the outcome of that. So we want more women in positions of power because we think that will inspire more women. But it might also inspire men in a certain way, right? And we can't control that, so, which is good. So identification is both, we think it will improve our lot, but we also cannot predict the direction in which that improvement will take place, which is a bit scary.
But it takes it away from identity politics or politics of identity.
Absolutely, which is what makes it so fascinating. Which is what allows, us, for instance, if you go back to say, Nizamuddin Chishti and Khusro clearly identifying as a damsel in distress after Nizamuddin's death, saying, I'm going to lie on this couch with my hair spread out. With bangles. The bangles comes earlier. After Chishti's dead, of course, he won't wear bangles because he's now a widow. And that kind of identification as a woman is very powerful and very erotic, but it's the opposite of identity politics. Unfortunately, the reason we need more representation of women or more representation of Dalits or more representation of underprivileged classes is precisely because we are caught in the world of identity politics. And in that world, at least this is one way of trying to address the skew in which we live. But for me, the larger, better, more radical way would actually be able to say, we're all in this together. And we have to think about desire, erotics, identification, fantasy, in ways that might undermine these divisions in a more, not lasting way, but in a more radical manner than this does.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you both for your wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you for staying with us.